daily life for the inhabitants of New France was one full of hard work and hardships. The land was not accustomed to being worked, and the weather was harsh for the winter months. In the beginning, the population was mainly male. They had come over on ships for fishing opportunities and then stayed for the fur trading opportunities, which were also available. The number of slaves who lived in Canada was estimated to be about 2,500 over the years of 1709 to 1833. Almost all of the slaves worked as domestic servants in the families of military officers, merchants, and government officials. At times, they even worked for the clergy. Only a third of the slaves were of African descent. The majority were of Aboriginal descent, known as Pawnees, after the Pawnee tribe. Slavery was abolished in 1833. While fishing was the primary reason for the settlements in New France, it became apparent that trapping and fur trading were the trades that were making the most in profit and economical gain. Europeans discovered that the short, soft fur close to the beaver skin was ideal for making beaver hats. The First Nations also brought fur pellets of otter, mink, marten, and fox. These pelts and skins were traded for European tools, pots, and liquor. Once the settlement were established along the St. Lawrence River, people began to settle in and break the land. It took a year to clear 1 hectare of land, and there was always danger of attack from the Haudenosaunee in the area. The Haudenosaunee were local natives of the land before the settlers came. Once the land was cleared, the farmers were able to grow wheat, peas, oats, rye, barley, maize, and hemp. The European diet was fairly limited. Most families couldn't afford meat, but fish was a cheaper source of protein and would add variety to their diet. This also lined up with the religious beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church, that Fridays were a day of fasting, so no meat was to be eaten on Fridays. The rest of their diet was from the land. Gardens were worked in the summer months, as well as the crops that were grown for cereal. In the European feudal system, seigneuries were plots of land that were given to noblemen. Seigneurs, the noblemen who were given the plots of lands, had to clear the land and encourage settlement within a certain amount of time. This land was then sublet in small parcels to peasant farmers. These farmers had to pay large sums of rent for the land through their harvest. They had to give up 1/14 of their harvest to the seigneur. In return, the seigneur was expected to clear the land and build and maintain a mill for grinding the grain. The seigneur also acted as a local magistrate who was there to uphold the French civil law. Each piece of land was a long, narrow rectangle that had access to the St. Lawrence River. This was to ensure that each land had access to the only transportation system at the time. For most of the years of New France being established, there was no transportation infrastructure. The roads they had were few, and they moved around somewhat by canals. The canals would be up to 3 miles long at times, and both were thin and simple. The most prevalent transportation source was the St. Lawrence River by canoe. In the winter, when the lake froze, both the poor and the rich traveled by sled pulled by dogs or horses. If people did not have access to sleds pulled by animals, they transported on foot. A land transportation system was not developed in the region until the 1830s. Then, stretches of road were built along the river. In the early days, it was mostly men who populated New France. These men were businessmen, fishermen, coureurs du bois, woodrunners, and farmers. The men outnumbered the women at 6 to 1. Although some women did pay their own way to New France, both before and after the period of Les Filles, it was the young woman sent at the expense of the king between 1663 and 1673 who helped to populate the lands. The women sent by the king were known as les filles du roi. Most of these women were strong country girls around 16 years old. Other girls that were sent were poor girls and orphans from Paris. Once they arrived in New France, young ladies were looked after by nuns until they were married off or joined a religious order. There were so few women compared to men that the young women found that they had their choice of mates. An extra bonus that came with Les Filles du Roi was a dowry that was supplied by King Louis. The young women often came with clothing and household supplies. The men were workers of their trade. They would spend their days fishing, hunting, trapping, or farming. The noblemen would manage their land, and the businessmen would trade and work the commerce. For the most part, the women had the role of supporting their husbands in whatever his trade was, and taking care of the home and children. In the summer months, the women gardened and raised food. The winters were quite unbearable compared to France, and they found them extremely harsh. Religion was central right from day one, when establishing New France. Among the first to settle were the missionaries. These missionaries were mostly the Ursuline sisters and the Jesuit priests. The missionaries tried to bring education and civilized behavior to the indigenous people. They believed that if they were to be civilized, they needed to be converted to Christianity. When the population of the French Canadians increased, the church provided social services and education to the community. Education was almost solely the responsibility of the church. The religious orders provided the instruction to the students. Primary schools were created to teach the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. There were secondary schools for the boys only. They were called trade schools. The elite were then able to attend the Jesuit College in Quebec, where they could study hydrography, law, chemistry, physics, geometry, and the art of navigation. Education was not something that was accessible to all. Very few people could even sign their name, and only a few members of the elite community possessed a library. In New France, religious rules or law were upheld as much as the law itself. Even alcohol sales had regulations put in place to preserve moral standards among both the Aboriginal peoples and the French population. The religious orders also provided the health care in New France. Female religious communities founded and ran the hospitals, which ministered to the sick, the poor, the elderly, and the beggars. Along with French pharmaceuticals, the hospitals implemented some Aboriginal practices and indigenous plants over the years. The government of New France was under the control of the king. A governor reported all matters to the king. It was the responsibility of the Sovereign Council to advise the governor. The council was made up of the intendant, the first of which was Jean Talon, the bishop, and some of the elite seigneurs who were most often military officers, government officials, merchants, and clergy. This council was also responsible for the lawmaking, and it was a court for criminal and civil cases. All public assemblies had to be pre-approved. People or merchants had to choose someone who would speak on everyone's behalf, and this person also needed to be approved by the government. The king permitted the merchants to gather for doing business and discussing trade. For the most part, the king was a good king, rather than a tyrant. He provided certain measures of social security and justice for his people.